I thought my apartment was haunted. The truth is so much worse. In retrospect, it should have been obvious from the start that there was something going on. It was my first time renting an apartment, but even I thought that the landlord was eager for me to move in as soon as possible. The rent was ridiculously low for the area. The apartment itself was in pristine condition, and the whole process from touring the apartment to moving only took about a week. Nothing like that comes without a catch. Apartment 311 was a pleasant place to live at first. It had 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and since I lived alone, that meant I got to convert 1 bedroom into my own office space. It came with a handful of paintings already, so it did not have the off-putting liminal feeling that some empty apartments have. The only immediate downside I could tell from the start was there was a slight smell in the living room. From time to time, it wasn't anything too noticeable, but you would occasionally get a faint whiff of some sort of musty odor. I was living in apartment 311 for a couple of weeks before I noticed anything was wrong. It started out with simple stuff, like various knickknacks being placed on the wrong shelves, snacks and small objects going missing. Things like that. Once or twice I found the fridge left open. These things would only happen when I was asleep, and it made me feel like I was going crazy. There was no way anyone could be breaking into my apartment just to steal some useless crud and move around some collectibles. The door was locked whenever I went to bed, and even if someone hypothetically had the key, I always made sure to bolt the door as well. I considered getting some security cameras set up, but I balked at the price when I looked into that possibility. Though, the apartment was admittedly cheap between rent and utilities, I still couldn't afford to set up an entire security system. I tried to put it out of my mind, assuming that maybe I was just sleepwalking, or getting up for a midnight snack and forgetting by the next morning. I'd never been an easy sleeper. I was often prone to night terrors and other disturbances, which had only gotten worse now that I was in an unfamiliar environment. Of all the sleep problems I've experienced, by far the least pleasant is sleep paralysis. It used to happen fairly rarely, maybe once every 2 to 3 months, but after moving into the apartment, it became an almost weekly occurrence. Now, usually my sleep paralysis is fairly mild. I find myself unable to move, eyes open, and I find it difficult to breathe. Sometimes I feel like there is a presence in the room with me, but before I moved, I had never experienced any form of hallucinations, visual or otherwise. I had never seen a ghost, monster, hag, or any other sort of entity while I was paralyzed. It was only ever a sense of dread and total paralysis of the body. That changed about the same time I noticed the missing food and misplaced objects. As usual, it felt like I had woken up but couldn't move a single muscle. It was hard to breathe, and I had this awful feeling like I wasn't alone. I tried to calm myself down, to remind myself that I had been through this before, and it always wound up okay. But something felt different. It was then that I noticed the door to my bedroom slowly opening, inch by inch. I could hear the creak of the hinges as it swung inward. Someone, or something, was coming into my room. He peeked his head around first, dull eyes reflecting the faint glow of moonlight from my bedroom window. He was bald, with pale, flaky skin. I wanted to scream when I saw his expression, but I was still a prisoner of my own body. The man had a forehead, rictus grinned on his face, chipped yellow teeth, clenched tightly together, grinding against one another. I watched in horror as the rest of the man's body slowly passed into the room, tiptoeing as if he was creeping up behind someone in a cartoon. The man was utterly emaciated, almost skeletal in appearance, and covered in sores and pockmarks. He was stark naked and smeared in dirt and filth. I could do nothing but watch as he slowly inched ever closer towards me. I could feel his hot breath upon my face. It smelled like the musty odor I sometimes detected in the living room. Not once did I see his expression change. He didn't even blink as he stared at me, and I could feel hatred radiating off of him like heat from a furnace. He just stood there, looking at me for what felt like hours. Eventually he turned around and slowly snuck back out of the room, gently shutting the door behind him. A few minutes later, I started to be able to move again, the paralysis wearing off, as my body started to wake up properly. I had to call in sick to my job that day. The experience was just such a shock to me that there was no way in hell I'd be able to get any work done. I spent a good hour just checking every room to make sure I was entirely alone. I searched in the closet, underneath the sinks, in my office, anywhere I thought someone could be hiding. When I found nothing, I managed to convince myself it was all a hallucination, and that I was safe. Things continued to be the same for a while after that. Objects still went missing from time to time. The smell in the living room stayed just as musty as it ever was, and about every week or so I'd have another sleep paralysis incident. Of course, now every time I did experience sleep paralysis, I'd have to see my unwanted visitor again. I named him Jimmy to try and reduce the terror a little bit. Putting a silly name to a horrifying face helped lessen my fear slightly. As far as sleep paralysis hallucinations went, Jimmy wasn't too bad. Once I started to get used to him, he never touched me or sat on my chest like some people's nightmares did. He just stood there and stared. It was still deeply unpleasant, mind you, but I felt lucky that it was consistent kind of unpleasantness at least. Then I found the photograph. I noticed it underneath a pile of papers while I was doing some cleaning up. A picture of two women embracing in front of a waterfall. I didn't recognize either of the women, and I assumed it must have been from the previous tenant. I texted the landlord, Greg, and asked if he still had the old tenant's phone number so I could give her a call. He obliged, and within a few minutes I was calling her. She picked up after a couple of rings, sounding slightly exasperated.
Hello, this is Rebecca. Who is this?
Hi, my name's Flora. I'm the current tenant of apartment 311. I think you may have left a photograph behind when you moved. I was wondering if you'd want to pick it up or if I could mail it to you or something. There was a long pause on the end of the phone. Hello? I asked.
You need to get out of that apartment. You're not safe.
I honestly didn't have any response but to laugh. Is this some kind of joke? I asked her in between chuckles. I heard her sigh with frustration.
It's not a joke. I'm serious. Things have been going missing, right?
That got my attention. How do you know that?
It happened with me too. My girlfriend and I kept noticing things being moved or disappearing while we were asleep. Little things mostly. Snacks, trinkets, nothing major. Now, I never saw this, but my girlfriend swears one time when she got up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water, she saw this naked man just staring at her. He was covered in sores and looked more like a corpse than a person. She woke me up and called the police, of course, but they didn't find anything, I think.
Rebecca paused for a moment, choosing her words. What? What is it? I asked, increasingly panicked. I began to worry that Jimmy was more than a simple hallucination.
I think 311 is haunted. We asked around some of the other residents, and apparently the last guy to live there just disappeared. Our best guess is that he must have died and his spirit just never left. My girlfriend is into some occult stuff, so she tried a cleansing ritual or something like that. But it didn't work. Things kept disappearing, and eventually we just decided to move.
I hung up the phone. It was rude, sure, but I was just so shocked that I didn't know what to do. At the very least, I began to understand why I got the apartment for so cheap. I found myself just sitting on the couch for a while, occasionally getting a whiff of that musty smell. I stared blankly at a painting on the wall, one of the ones which was already there when I first moved in. It depicted a woman in a dress, sitting underneath a tree reading a book. I couldn't tell what it was, making me so focused on it. It seemed utterly unrelated to what was happening. Eventually, I snapped out of it and went into my office to do some research. After a little bit of digging, I found some information regarding the tenant who had lived there before Rebecca, the one who disappeared. Apparently, one of the co-workers put out a missing persons report 6 months ago. His name was Michael Hansen, and I gasped when I saw a photograph of him. He looked exactly like Jimmy, albeit not so emaciated and filthy. I hastily packed some of my things and made arrangements to stay at a friend's house for a couple nights, telling them that my apartment had a roach problem and the landlord needed to fumigate it. I called into work and gave them a sob story about an uncle dying, enough to get time off for a few days. With no more distractions from the ghost of Michael Hansen, I slept soundly on my friend's couch, unbothered by any sleep paralysis. The next 2 days were spent researching. I checked out dozens of books on folklore and the occult from the local library, scoured paranormal internet forums, and even watched a few episodes of some cheesy ghost hunting TV shows. I was determined to figure out a way to put the spirit of Michael Hansen to rest. The stories were all wildly different, with countless potential solutions to my problem. Some sources said that salt was a surefire way to banish spirits. Others said that iron was a good ghost repellent, but most simply said I should give up and move. However, one myth piqued my interest. According to some beliefs, the spirit of the unquiet could be tied to objects from their life, binding them to the place where the object resided. If the object which their soul was bound to was destroyed, it freed their spirit and they could move on to the afterlife. I remembered the paintings. I had assumed that they were put there by the landlord, but it was just as possible that they were left there by Michael. I arrived back to the apartment, determined to grab the paintings and burn them, laying Mike Hansen's soul to rest once and for all. I felt like some sort of hero, a badass monster who saved the day with putting her intuition and a little bit of book smarts. One by one, I pulled the paintings off the walls, putting them in a cardboard box. I made a mental note to buy some lighter fluid on my way to the empty lot where I planned to burn them. I approached the final painting, the one which showed a woman in a white dress beneath the tree. I pulled it off the wall and recoiled as the musty smell increased in intensity. Staring in confusion, I saw a small rectangular hole where the painting used to be, about 4 feet off the ground and 2 feet by 2 feet in length and width. I shuddered in fear, remembering that Michael's body was never found. Perhaps he was murdered, his corpse hidden in the walls by some unknown assailant? I nervously flicked on my flashlight, peered within the hole, and screamed. I ran out of the apartment 311 as fast as I could before calling the police, sobbing with terror. I had been prepared to find a body, maybe cut up into little pieces, wrapped in duct tape. I was ready for death and decay and rot. There is something fascinating about ghosts, something somehow romantic about the notion that part of someone could live on even after death. There was nothing romantic about seeing the clenched, toothed grimace of Michael Hansen glaring at me with hate as he stood in the small section of hollow wall which he had been living in for the past 6 months.
I remember living on the streets, that I remember. Exactly how that came to be is still unclear, but I know that one way or another it was because of my parents. I hated them. Hate them with the little memory of them I have left. Flashes of pure terror. Like being beaten bloody on my 6th birthday. And being trapped in a closet for weeks at a time with little interaction and even less food. This is how I remember life with my parents. The only food I ever got was dog chow. Tuna meant for cats if I tried to be bold. I don't remember if it was a pet or a sibling, but there was something that they loved more than me. Something that always got all the attention. What it was doesn't matter now. I've seen horror all my life. I lived on the streets for a while. I think it came up 2 years ago, but it could have been more. It felt like a lifetime. Sleeping on playgrounds and benches, stealing or eating out of trash bags just to survive. I was about 11 when Alice picked me up. She found me, cradled in the fetal position, behind a dumpster between 2 buildings, the names of which I couldn't read. I was just skin and bone back then. She said I had blood on me, but whether or not it was mine, I still don't remember. I was in shock from something. That's when I met her. When Alice took me in, she promised a new way of life. She promised a family, love and nurturing. But most of all, she promised food. Real food. She took me to her car and drove me up to the manor where she lived. I do remember that she didn't actually drive. We sat in the back of a long black car with slick red interior leather, as an old man wearing a little hat drove me to my new home. The building reminded me of a haunted mansion I saw in a movie once when I snuck into the theater. I've never eaten so much popcorn before in my life. People just left it all over the floor, and nobody else was trying to get it. I don't remember what the movie was, but it made me not want to go back into that building. I screamed, I cried, I punched the driver in the eye. But through the soothing mystique of Alice's welcoming voice, I was coaxed inside. Whilst under the spell of her sweet voice and intoxicating aroma of love and flowers, Alice took me by the hand and walked me into the tall building that towered before us. Once inside, she introduced me to the 4 others she was living with. 5, I guess. There was Wilbur, a lanky teen with sandy blonde hair, his girlfriend Mary, who was about 10 years his senior, with her beautiful brown eyes and vibrant rose lips, Jeremiah, who was about my age at the time, but seemed to be so much older. And Junk. Junk was only a little younger than Alice, who must have been in her 20s at the time. Junk was skittish, but they were all very kind to me, and they all wore suits. The girls had skirts coming off their suits, with solid black leggings. Everybody had soft black suits with white gray undershirts, and ties that varied from shades of purple and blue. They welcomed me in a spectacular ceremony, and explained that I just entered a magical place, which they called Elysium. The 5th body was of a man climbing 30 years or more, named Jack. He didn't appear until after the welcoming ceremony. Everybody mostly referred to Jack as Sir or father. His suit was the smoothest shade of black, and he wore shiny gold cufflinks. His undershirt was dark purple, and his tie was red. His hair was black and well gelled. The streaks of white and silver at the side of his head did not appear as an ancient feature, but as magnificent and distinguished. His emerald green eyes were like portals to another world. I felt as though I knew everything when I looked into them. I thought I felt that way because he had so much raw power. One could absorb some simply by looking into his eyes. He was an eccentric being, always making a spectacle when entering a room. Even when he remained silent, his presence was heavy and enlightening. His presence was that of a god. Even if you were blindfolded when Jack stood in the same room as you, you would know. You could feel him, watching, breathing, reading your mind. You could always feel him. My name was Kevin when I first arrived, but Jack dubbed me Abel. He named everyone, and he thought of everybody as his children. He called us his children. Jack took each of us from desperate times. Wilbur worked at his father's surf shop, somewhere far, far away. But he also worked in his father's drug trade. If Wilbur ever disobeyed his father, he would beat him and inject him full of something called heroin. This was apparently a means of keeping Wilbur from leaving, as his father's was the only place where he could get more of it. Wilbur said after having heroin once, you needed it all the time. Junk also lived a fair life of abuse. Jack found him after his principal had dumped him in a ditch and left him there for dead. Apparently, wherever it was that he attended, the entire school hated him, students and staff alike. They would call him Junk, so Jack told him to turn that weakness into a strength. And he made that his new name. It never quite had the effect Jack was hoping for. Or maybe it did. Wilbur and Junk were the only ones who dared to tell me about their lives before Jack. Speaking of a time before Jack was strictly prohibited because we didn't need anything else. Jack had been the only one to ever care about us. Nobody else would, and this is something he would remind us often. He told me once that he was to make sure we were never ungrateful. The whole house was my family, but Wilbur and Junk were my friends. My best friends, my brothers. Though Jeremiah, and I did have our share of heart-to-hearts, and I'm pretty sure he wanted my head on a spike. I knew he'd have my back. He was my brother after all, and he would protect me, but maybe it was because he wanted him to be the only one allowed to hurt me. He and Jack. Jack and the others taught me that Elysium was a holy place, untouchable by those unworthy. They said that those with truly dark hearts saw nothing when they looked up at the building, or the property on which it stood. That to them it simply was not here. I'd heard vague descriptions of heaven in the past, which Jack said was close to Elysium, but not quite. Elysium was a place where lost souls could go, with their hearts still beating. A paradise for the broken, if you will. And once you die, your soul remains there. It simply traveled to a parallel plane of existence, invisible not only to wicked hearts, but anything that drew breath. However, Jack wasn't like us. He said he stood in both planes, that when we died and shifted to the next, he would greet us as the same spirit he's always been, but in a completely different form. He told us that our own appearances would be changed forever, details depending on the wavelengths of one's soul. We would take on our true forms. Jack's ability to see and exist in both planes explained why he would sometimes speak as if in a conversation with someone, despite us seeing nothing. Even when Jack thought none of us were around, this was him talking to those on the other side, in forms incomprehensible to those on the outer plane. Within my first week of living in Elysium, Jack professed to me that if he were capable of having favorites, I would be it. He said that he saw a lot of potential in me. Jer overheard this and never truly got over it. Jack had to be stern with me sometimes, beating me with his cane or taking me to the dark chamber. But compared to everyone else, I was always the golden child. I almost never stepped out of line. So I didn't really have the same experience at Elysium as everyone else. Apparently, whenever Jack thought someone broke a very serious rule or too many rules, he would come for you when you were alone and perform some mysterious act of horror upon you. Jack slept with everyone in Elysium as a way to bring our souls closer together. It was a horrifying thing to experience, every second of it terrible. But even so, they said this was not the mysterious punishment, nor was it the visits to the dark chamber. But as far as I was concerned, those were the two worst experiences to have in the house. It bewildered me to think that there was something even worse than the tortures that met you in the dark chamber. And to this day, I still don't have any details, or even a vague idea of the mysterious act. Whatever it was sometimes made people to want to leave, but they didn't. We all stayed because there was nowhere else to go. No one else to go to. Jack was all there was. He was our God, our home in heaven. Months after she disobeyed and experienced this mysterious horror, Alice told me something that nobody else had shared before. Because it was prohibited, she told me her name before Jack. It was Donna. Her friends used to call her Dawn or Donnie. She said sometimes she missed that name. She felt that when Jack changed her name, he changed who she was, and sometimes she didn't like that person. Not at all. Overall, Jack was kind to us. He took care of us, he fed us. We all ate together, we read together, and we bathed together every week. We were a family. We never left Elysium. The property was rather large, so we still went outside, but we never truly left. The only people who could leave the house were Jack and his butlers. Alice used to go out, in charge of finding new members. But one day, something happened, and that changed. Jack gave the job to Mary, but after a week, he simply kept the duty to himself. He even stopped taking the butler, saying he could trust few. Over the years, a few more children were added, and it was great. Our family was growing. But when I was about 16, it seemed as though Jack was letting anybody with a shady past into our doors. There was no great selection, no light. He saw in them as he saw in me. He was simply recruiting. We started having larger ceremonies where Jack would explain how we were to live our lives in Elysium, and how evil and wretched the outside world was. How he was all we had and all we needed. I hated many of the new children, the ones let in because they had a shady past and a beating heart. They had no morals, no respect, no love. They would pick small groups and remain in them. They would ridicule anyone who wasn't a part of them. We were supposed to be a family, siblings, as though we shared blood, but that was no longer the case. Amari and Adriel were the worst of the bunch, the ringleaders of all the bad apples that had corrupted Elysium's holy basket. It was like they thought they were Jack. They looked like they were identical twins, even though Amari was a boy and Adriel a she-devil. But they were also lovers. Years ago, that would have disgusted me, but things like that became regular practice in Elysium. I was about 20 to 23 when we reached 40 or so members. I believe just below 40. I don't know exactly how old I was, because that's something we don't keep track of in Elysium. You are not to keep track of days, years, or months. You can recognize the seasons, but you cannot count them. Jack said this was because Elysium was eternity, and to try to know one's age was to deny and reject that eternity. But Alice had gifted me a calendar to hide. I would mark it almost every 2 moons, and we should try to celebrate my birthday when we had the chance. I was eternally grateful for this. I've always loved numbers, but I've never been able to count very high. When Jack found the calendar, Alice took the fall. It had trucks on it. February was a fire truck. I never saw Alice after that. I guess she disobeyed Jack one too many times and was sent off to Garnish. Garnish was where disloyal members went, those who were not worthy to bathe in Elysium's holy energy. Where this was, I didn't know, but nobody ever came back from Garnish, ever. I loved Alice. She was like a mother to me, or an elder sister. I had many siblings, and I had my group of friends, but with Alice it was different. I'd always call her Donna in private, and she'd always call me Kevin in private. She was the only one. I loved Donna so much, but I always thought that Alice sounded prettier. Things were never the same after Jack sent Alice away, and with the new members I hardly saw Jack. Sure, I would see him speaking during ceremonies or sometimes during mealtime, but never one-on-one. He still called us his children, but it didn't feel that way anymore. No, things were different. I was different. I was growing tired of Jack ruling over Elysium. He didn't care about us anymore. I knew he didn't. I was tired of living in Elysium. I've always been told that the world outside was where the devil ruled, and my few memories of childhood definitely supported that, but so what? Who's to say Jack was not the devil? Could God and Satan not be one and the same? He who could exist on 2 planes was surely capable of wearing more than one face. The cleansing began when Amaris spoke ill of Alice. I thought I'd heard it before, but it was always in a crowded area, so I could never be sure. This time it was in the quiet hole just before our chambers. He called me scum and said that Alice was a whore who strayed from Jack's path and deserved to suffer and garnish. I grabbed a fistful of hair and crashed the blonde fool's head over the hall window. Noise didn't matter. Nobody was to leave their chambers at this light. Only Jack could, and his chambers were on the other side of Elysium. I grabbed a shard of glass and cut his throat. He gurgled at me with teary eyes, and I prayed to Alice. I remember in the beginning I was very keen on covering my trails. I didn't want to know how such an act would be treated by Jack, or the other members for that matter. Order was lost. These new members were clear agents of chaos. I used to think that such fools didn't deserve to bask in Elysium, but as I went on with the cleansing, I wondered if Elysium had not been garnished all along. I soaked up the blood with the sheets and threw them in the furnace. I could not throw Morris in along with them because not only was I unsure if it would completely burn his bones or not, regular maintenance of the furnace was kept, and somebody would be checking up on it just before the day rise. So I wrapped Morris in more sheets. We had so many. Jack said it was in preparation for a growing family, and placed him outside in Elysium's court. One thing Jack teaches you is how to be one with the animals. I called a bird to my hand and broke its neck. I threw it up into the windows I'd broken with Amari and carried on. I got a shovel from the green room and dragged Amari to the woods. I dug for many breaths, of which I lost count, and buried the bastard under the dirt. I'd cut my hand on the piece of glass I used on Amari's. It bled and screamed agony as I dug and I buried, but Jack had taught me that pain was only in the mind. I was on a mission, I had to carry it out. While walking through the woods, I spotted a stick protruding from the earth. I found the stick curious because it was bright orange. How strange, I thought, so I dug the area around the orange stick, unsure of what I would find. What I did find was a woman, decaying with worms and maggots wriggling around in the remains of her flesh. I gifted Alice a green tie once. I found it while wandering in the field. I liked the color green, and I thought she deserved some individuality. This upset Jack, of course, but at the same time, he was still partial to me and let it slide. This woman had on that tie, as I'm sure you've guessed. The woman I found was Alice. I did some more walking and found a rather large area littered with orange sticks. I had found garnish. I had to ditch my bloodied suit walking back to Elysium in nothing but my shoes and my briefs. Of course I had extra suits, but only so many. I prayed Jack would not count them, because I couldn't think of a good reason why one should be missing. When night became day, I helped the butlers clean up the glass and used one of their shots to reopen the wound on my hand, so it wouldn't seem suspicious. Nobody thought the better of it. Nobody but Adriel. Many assume Amari had simply abandoned Elysium, and Jack saw him dishonored. He even held a ceremony about it, but she was not convinced. In fact, his disappearance drove her mad. She would not shut up about foul play, not until Jack ordered her to. Adriel became a silent being after that. Despite this fact, I decided she was next. She got on my nerves, and though she seemed innocent now, I knew she was still pulling the strings on Elysium's bad apples. I've never heard whispers of a mutiny. If anybody was gonna take that bastard Jack down, it was gonna be me. But first, I had to destroy what he created. The story of Adriel's demise isn't really one of much interest. She was in the green room and I beat her to death with a hammer. Simple as that. I didn't even say anything. Didn't feel anything either. Not even rage. It was just a minor chord. The only interesting and right-worthy things about it were some memories flooded back during the act. I'm still unsure exactly what brought me to the streets as a child, but I do remember what happened to my mother. My father started having me make his meals. I made him 4 dishes before I doused one with rat poison. When my mother caught me with the box of poison in one hand and my father's plate in the other, she threatened my life. Instinctively, I reached for the closest object on the counter behind me, and I beat her head in with a meat tenderizer mallet, just as I beat Adriel. I know it's not very interesting. I've never been a good storyteller. But it was nice to have at least one happy memory from my childhood. From Kevin's childhood, I should say. The cleansing couldn't wait after that. I didn't want a slow process. I wanted blood and death. I decided I would simply burn the building to the ground with everyone inside. But before I could do so, I still had a few chores. My intent was to tear down everything Jack had created. That included my family and my friends. I decided I would go to Junk first. Joe and Wilbur got stronger than we had first met, but Junk never really changed that much. I knew physically he would be the easiest. My friends deserved more than just burn away in that place. They deserved something better, closer, more personal. I did love them, I really did. Junk often liked to prepare the family's meals, so I offered to help him. It did occur to me that I could poison the children of Elysium as I tried with my father, but that would taint my final moments with Junk. He was always a dear friend to me, and I loved him like a brother, a real brother. He snuck out with me that night so we could watch the stars, a favorite pastime that we hadn't done in quite a while. I guess things just got too busy for the both of us with all the new members. We sat together on the grass, just staring at the night sky. I asked him if he knew how much he meant to me. He didn't know the extent, so I told him. We cried. He stood up to give me a proper hug. I held him tight, as if the breeze would blow him away. I retrieved the discreet kitchen knife I swiped earlier that day and drove it into his back. His last word was a whisper. He asked me, "Why?" I looked at him for a second and put my hand over his shoulder, unable to answer. I wanted the embrace to last, but I knew it couldn't. I drove the blade in further, and it gave a twist. He fell to my feet, and I opened his neck just to be sure. He didn't need to suffer any more than he already had. I buried him next to Alice. I had stolen a can of green paint from the storage room and gave them 2 green sticks crossing into X's. I planned to kill Wilbur next, but at this point Mary was pretty old, so I went with her instead. Jeremiah and Wilbur were the strongest, so they were the last. I waited for Wilbur to leave their chamber to run an errand for Jack. I slipped into the room expecting her to be in bed, but instead she was bathing. They had their own bathroom. I didn't have my own bathroom. I had to share a chamber with 6 others, and these 2 were with their own private chamber and their own private bathroom. What a world. She heard me walking and I called out. She thought I was Wilbur. I told her I appreciated how she was mostly kind to me in my life. She screamed and I had to drown the old broad in her own filth. Such a dishonorable death, I know. But I was only working with what the world gave me at the time. I put about 8 moons or so space in between the disappearances. It seemed less suspicious that way. At least that's how I thought of it. I guess I was a semi-flawed plan because I never really did cleanse Wilbur. 6 moons after Mary's death, Wilbur hung himself off the balcony with his belt. Elysium became very unsettled after that, and people started to notice the disappearances. I didn't only kill my family personally. There were others that I cleansed out of the sheer opportunity. But none of them mattered. I won't even write their names, much less how they died, because they were nothing less than nothing to me. The fear going on around Elysium was like electricity in the air. I think there were ceremonies explaining how these disappearances were holy acts, but I stopped attending those. I feared I may lose control and simply jump up on the podium and beat Jack to death before he could watch his empire fall. I found Jeremiah in the food court by himself, and it wasn't even mealtime. He was crying. I've only seen him cry twice before. Such an ugly sight, heartbreaking. When he saw me, he was hesitant, but he allowed me to sit, and we spoke for many breaths. It was just me and him now. We were the only ones left in our family. We knew there were others before us. Mary spoke of the many who were off to garnish even before she arrived, but the 6 of us were a real family. I decided it would be easiest to cleanse Jeremiah the way I had junk. I could feel the blade in my pocket, but I only needed the conversation to last a little longer. This was the last of my family. I needed it to last, but he got up for a hug and I felt a pain strike my heart. At least he could die like his brother. He pulled me in for an embrace and we stood there for a good moment. When I reached for the blade, he caught my movement. He questioned me, so I needed to be quick. I swung for his spine, but he grabbed my arm and headbutted me, instinctively breaking my nose. He began a frantic apology, but his eyes would not leave the blade. He put it together, clever punk. I tried to explain what I was doing needed to be done. I needed to cleanse the world and all of us of Jack's plight, but he thought me insane. It's funny. I think in the false book, Abel is the brother who is murdered, not the brother that murders. I fought Jeremiah to the best of my abilities, but despite our shared age, it was superior. I lay propped against the meal bench, his food on my chest, and the blade held above his head. I was sure this was my end, but a cruelly comedic turn of events. Jack entered the meal hall. He shouted for Jer to stop. Jer just told Jack that he didn't understand and I needed to die. He swung the blade down towards me, and just as I expected my fate, a loud boom shocked me to my core. It stopped my heart and my breath. I had never heard such a piercing sound. Jer dropped the blade and fell to the floor. There was a hole in his back. Jack stood pointing with his strange metal object. Could that small thing have been what caused such a monstrous sound and brought my brother to such a quick demise? It seemed absurd, but there was no other explanation. Jack really was a being separate from humans. No mortal could wield such power. He needed to be taken down. But what other abilities could he hold? It occurred to me that I really didn't know anything about Jack at all, but it didn't matter. Though it sickened my heart, I told Jack Jer had made an attempt on my life, and in doing so, he admitted to me that he was the cause of the recent disappearances, that he was trying to cleanse the corrupted Elysium and tear down all that Jack had built. There was no reason not to believe me. Now my time was out. I needed to rid the world of Elysium once and for all. Unfortunately, I still had to wait 3 moons. I still wanted Jack to be the last alive, so I had to wait for him to go into town for supplies. Some of the newcomers believed he didn't leave at all, that he just made the supplies appear with his great magic. But I knew better. The fox only left at night when everybody was bound for their chambers by his command. The second he left, I got to work. I sealed all the exits and stuck sticks I sharpened into the ground below any glass windows, so anyone who tried to escape by breaking them would be impaled. Barbaric, I know. I lined the halls with gasoline from the storage room and flammables and waited on the front steps for Jack. When I saw his hearse at the end of the road driving back towards Elysium, I tossed my match and watched my home of many years go up in a beautiful cleansing flame. Everybody died, everybody burned, and everybody died. They were all cleansed by my hand. May Ganesh revel in my victory. I attempted to take Jack by surprise. As he stood staring at my flames helplessly, I lunged and caught my blade straight in his shoulder. He fought and he was strong, but he was old. I was going to give him a slow death, but he reached into his suit, and again I heard the impossibly loud noise that claimed Ger. There was a hole in my left eye. I stood staring in bewilderment at it and fell to my knee. His magic had pierced me. He was confused. The old man demanded an explanation. I grabbed a large rock and struck him across the face. The noise. There was a hole in my right arm. I threw the rock at his knee and crawled quickly over to him. I grabbed the rock with my left hand and crawled the distance. I bashed his withered old skull until I was hitting nothing but dirt. I had finally cleansed all his sin. I had won. Almost. There was still one more thing to do, but first I had to mend my wounds. I planned for his magic. I hid medkits in the area if I need them, and I did, very badly. I stopped the bleeding and bandaged my wounds. I took the hearse and drove away from Elysium. away from Ganesh. When I was young, Jack taught me how to drive the hearse, never going too far from Elysium. If not for those lessons, I would have succumbed to my own injuries and died on the way back to town. In preparation for this fiasco, I stole money from Jack's chamber and put it in some of those medkits. When I got into town, I purchased the chamber in a small building called Motel, with pen and papers from the man who ran Motel, and got to work. I haven't written in some time, so I hope it's still legible. This tale had to be told. The tale of Elysium, of Jack and his personally designed Antichrist. Whoever finds this, share this with the rest of your world. Let them know what went on in your backyard. I guess this is too long to be a suicide note, so think of it as a chronicling to a blistering fall. My final act will be cleansing the world of my own life. I would like to continue living, might be okay with that, and maybe the world would accept Kevin on its own. But Kevin died with Alice. He's in the dirt laying beside the beautiful Donna and his family marked by green in the great Ganesh. Abel was a creation of Jack, and so he must fall. May a better Elysium find you. Sincerely, Abel.
Always check your kids' Halloween candy. Written by Priestess of Spiders on Reddit. Everyone knows the horror stories. Razor blades, hallucinogens, rat poison, all disguised in candy, just waiting for innocent kids to gobble them up. It's all nonsense, of course. Sure, there are a few isolated incidents where some sicko does something like that, but the whole tainted candy myth is an enormous exaggeration at best. No, the reason I say you should check your kids' candy is very, very different. It was the Halloween of '09. I was only 14. I was on the cusp of being ever so slightly too old for it to be socially acceptable to go trick-or-treating, so I aimed to make that night my biggest haul yet. My costume was elaborate, a zombie with a full face mask, claw gloves, and a chest piece that would drip fake blood at the push of a button. I learned from experience that the more detailed a costume, the more candy you get. I was going to hit every house I could. I expected to get so much that I even bought one of those big black garbage bags to hold the candy in. I was going to make it a night to remember. But not for the reasons I had hoped. I couldn't tell you which house I got it from. That's something that has always bugged me. My bag was so full, and I visited so many houses, that it was all just a blur. At the end of the night, I was sorting my candy into piles. A small mound of chocolate bars, some plastic wrapped in gummy candies, dozens of lollipops, and more. As I reached into the central pile of unsorted candy, I found something quite unusual. It looked like a chocolate bar of some sort, but one I had never seen before. The wrapper was a greenish yellow in coloration, with a two-armed cartoon worm giving a thumbs up and winking. The label was in some other language, the symbols not corresponding to any Latin letters that I recognized. At first I thought it was maybe in Russian, but the script wasn't quite right. I'd seen what Cyrillic characters looked like in some video games and movies, and this looked a little bit different. Raising an eyebrow, I opened the wrapper, curious to see what was inside. It looked like my initial guess was right. It did seem to be a chocolate bar of some sort, with little white orbs embedded in its surface, kind of like how some candies had pieces of nuts. I gave it a bite and was pleasantly surprised to find that it was utterly delicious. To this day, I think it was one of the best chocolate bars I've had in my entire life. Being a 14-year-old, I didn't have the best impulse control. I gobbled the whole thing down in about 30 seconds, tossing the wrapper aside and searching for more in the pile of unsorted candy. I didn't find any more, however, and resigned myself to disappointment. I figured I would ask around at school, bringing the wrapper to see if anyone else had gotten lucky. Maybe I could offer some of my less enticing candy as trade. After finishing my sorting and eating a few more pieces of candy, I finally headed off to sleep, my stomach full and my heart happy. It had been a great day. The next morning I made sure to pack the empty chocolate wrapper so I could ask around at school, and bought some extra candy for trade. During recess at lunch, I asked nearly the whole school about the chocolate, but I only found 3 other people who got one. And they, like me, had immediately eaten the whole thing. I still remember their names. Jeremy, a lanky, bespectacled kid from chemistry class. Ashley, a girl with dyed blue hair, who I'd seen around but never really talked to. And Lee, a track and field athlete, who I share math class with. They all agreed that it was by far the best chocolate they'd ever had, and had also been hoping to find some more. However, it seemed like the trail ended there. None of them remembered which house gave them the chocolate bar either. It was a little sad, but ultimately it wasn't the end of the world for me. It was just a candy bar after all. It took me a few weeks to notice anything strange. I had long since forgotten about the candy bar, and now that Halloween had come and gone, it was back to the daily routine of school and homework. One morning I woke up to find myself feeling very thirsty. It felt like I had been walking in the desert for days, so I immediately got up to get something to drink. Normally with breakfast I would have milk or orange juice, but that day I decided I would just have a big glass of water, and then another, and then another. After 3 glasses, I was finally satisfied. My mom eyed me with an eye of confusion. "Feeling a little bit dehydrated, honey?" she asked. I nodded, a little embarrassed. "I'm not sure why. I just felt really thirsty this morning," I responded. She smiled and said smugly, "Well, at least it's not soda or energy drinks. Those things will rot your teeth, you know." I rolled my eyes and finished my breakfast, getting ready for school and bringing the bottles of water with me. That day during chemistry class, our teacher announced that Friday there would be a school day-long field trip to the local lake, where a fish and wildlife representative would talk to us about the native ecosystem and the environmental impact of pollution. It was not mandatory, but students who went and wrote a paper about it would get extra credit. The teacher said anyone who wanted to go should raise their hand, and instantly I found myself raising mine. Jeremy did too, and I detected the faintest hint of confusion on his face. I also felt a little bewildered. I had never really been particularly interested in the environmentalism or anything like that, and it's not like I needed the extra credit. But something about the field trip seemed to call to me, like I was meant to go there. The rest of the week passed agonizingly slow. I found myself constantly thinking about the lake, about its cool green waters, rippling gently in the breeze, Every morning I would wake up thirstier than the last, until my mom was starting to grow concerned about my water intake. I bought one of those huge water bottles that athletes used, and I noticed that Jeremy and Ashley had as well. Lee already had one, but I noticed him drinking from it more often than normal in math class. Finally, Friday came around, and the small number of students going to the lake got into the school bus. I couldn't help but notice Lee and Ashley were coming too, but I was quickly distracted by the thought of the lake. I'd never been one for water. It was fun to go to the pool once in a while, but I'd never been obsessed over it. However, all I could think of during the bus ride to the lake about how good it would feel to just dive into the shimmering water, to sink all the way to the bottom and stay there, surrounded by fish. When we finally arrived, the fish and wildlife guy had us all sit down on the grass. He told us about pH levels, showed us a preserved frog with too many legs, and passed around photos of some of the garbage he found on the water's edge. I was not paying attention though. I was just staring out at that lake, hypnotized by its gentle waves. I thought about how nice it would feel on my skin and in my mouth. Before I knew it, what I was doing, I was standing up, walking towards the lake. I could faintly hear the chaperone yelling at me to come back, and some of the other students murmuring in confusion, but I wasn't focused on that. It was just background noise. The sounds of the lake filled my ears. I was vaguely aware that I wasn't alone in my march towards the lake. Jeremy, Ashley, and Lee were all walking with me, similarly fixated. I felt my tennis shoes sink into the cold water as we kept walking onwards. As I kept moving, the water went up to my knees, and then my thighs, and then my waist, my chest, and then my neck. Finally, my head was fully submerged, and I looked out into the murky gloom, not even trying to hold my breath as I inhaled the lake water. Then came the sudden realization of what was happening. Where I was. It was as if I had been a puppet whose strings were suddenly cut. I was fully aware of the fact that I was drowning, and then came the pain. I could feel wriggling under my skin, a burning, itching pain like needles shooting up from inside my flesh. I looked down and saw long, pallid worms erupt out of my skin like moles, digging out from the earth. I tried to scream, my mouth once again flooding with water, as one of them squirmed out from underneath my eyelid. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all came writhing up as they burrowed through my flesh. The pain was unbearable, and my vision started to fade to black as I passed out from a combination of agony, terror, and a lack of oxygen. I woke up in the hospital, my parents standing over me, their eyes filled with concern. I felt so tired, but thankfully not thirsty at all. When they realized I was awake, my mom smothered me with hugs and kisses, while my dad just started sobbing with relief. I asked about the others, the 3 students who went into the lake with me, but they didn't make it. There was only time to rescue one of us. The doctors were at a loss to explain the puncture wounds all over my body, and I said it wasn't anything too severe, and that I should be able to recover with some pain medicine and antibiotics. I did not tell them about the worms. I knew I would not be believed anyway, and I didn't want to end up locked away in some institution. I already had to have therapy sessions, and got put on some antidepressants. Apparently the authorities cooked up some story about an unaliving pact between Jeremy, Ashley, Lee, and I. I played along with the story to the therapist, talking about feeling overwhelmed at school and whatnot. But it was all nonsense. I was not depressed in the least, not before this happened. I did some independent research trying to figure out what happened to me, and what I found was startling. There is a phylum of worm called Nemamorpha, also known as horsehair worms. They typically infect insects, growing inside them and controlling their central nervous system to make them jump into the water and drown. Once the host leaps into the water, the worm burrows its way out of the host, continuing its life aquatically to find a mate and lay eggs. There are a few cases of accidental infection of humans, but there is no recorded evidence of them ever manipulating a mammal the way they control insects. I also found something else out. A few weeks after Halloween, every year, like clockwork, there is a spike in child deaths due to drowning. It is not enough to be noticed by most people, but it is obvious once you're looking for it. So I'll say it to you again. Always check your kids' Halloween candy. If you find a greenish-yellow chocolate bar with writing in a language you've never seen before, don't let them eat it, no matter what. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, it helps the channel a lot. See you next time. Never take a sleeping pill called Somnidrill. You might never wake up again. Written by Priestess of Spiders on Reddit. Like and subscribe if you enjoy, and check out the original story down below. Now, without further ado, let's get started, shall we? I have always had horrible insomnia. Ever since I was a very young child, I would find myself tossing and turning at night, unable to fall asleep. It was a rare day when I woke up feeling even mostly well rested. I started taking melatonin and some other meds that could help me sleep at a fairly young age. They helped a bit, but people still commented on the near constant bags under my eyes. A little over a week ago, I stopped by the local grocery store after work, looking to get a fresh supply of sleeping pills to replace the ones I ran out of the night before. I went to the usual spot and just grabbed a bottle blindly. Not even looking at it. The cashier did not seem to look either, just scanned it and tossed it into a little plastic bag, which I would add to the already substantial pile which overflowed out of my trash can. It wasn't until late at night I actually took a look at the bottle, and I was angry. Sure, from a distance, it looked like the usual brand I got, but up close it was markedly different. It looked like some cheap knockoff, deliberately designed to look similar to the name brand in order to trick the unwary buyer into buying it. The label on the bottle said Somnidrill in crisp blue lettering, with no slogan, no chemical name, or anything else useful. I couldn't even find a company logo. I checked for the drug facts, hoping that at least it would have the same active ingredients as what I usually used. But no luck. All I could find on the back was a single sentence. Take 1 pill before bed. There was no way to tell what this drug was, and I groaned in frustration and fatigue. I figured I would try to get some rest without medicine tonight. I didn't want to risk it. I turned on my white noise machine, put on my eye mask, and tried to rest. As the minutes turned to hours, the bottle of Somnidrill on the bedside started to feel more and more appealing. Finally, at nearly 3 a.m., I gave in and opened the bottle, The pills inside were gel capsules, filled with an opaque purple liquid. Without a second thought, I dry swallowed one and went back to bed. I started to try to count sheep in my head to tire myself. I got to 23 sheep before I lost consciousness. I suddenly found myself on hard concrete. I rubbed my eyes, standing up as best I could. When I opened them, I found I wasn't in my room. I stood on the edge of a tall building, looking over an enormous, brutalist city extending as far as I could see. Endless chaotic masses of angular gray buildings, surrounded by thick mist. I couldn't see the ground or the sky. Eventually, everything was so foggy, it was as if there was nothing there but buildings forever. Enormous spires of dark concrete extended for what seemed like miles into the sky, larger than any metropolitan building in the real world. There were no windows on any of the titanic structures, no lights to show I wasn't alone. The smell of the mold was heavy in the air, and I began to feel woozy. My eyelids fluttered as I started to lean towards the edge, about to fall. I woke up in bed, the faint sunlight pouring through my apartment window. It was about a minute before the alarm was due to go off. Normally, when I dream about falling, I wake up in a cold sweat, panicked, heart racing. This was different. I felt so energized, so utterly awake and ready to seize the day. Whatever this somni drill was, it was certainly working to fix my insomnia. The other employees at my cruddy minimum wage job were surprised to see how energized I was, and even my manager complimented me on my work. The endless parade of annoying customers seemed a little bit more bearable, less grating. I felt truly rested for the first time of my life. When it came to go to bed, I happily took another pill, genuinely looking forward to waking up well rested and focused. I counted how long it would take for me to lose consciousness. I got to exactly 23 seconds before I once again found myself in that strange gray city. This time I was on a terrace, once again overlooking the impossible, endless metropolis. I turned away from the sight, not wanting to fall like the last time. There was a doorway leading into the building, dimly illuminated despite there being no light source. I stepped inside, the slap of my bare feet echoing through the gloom and fog. The stench of decay and dampness increased as I walked through a maze of winding gray corridors, taking turns at random. Clusters of black mold dotted the walls, with tendrils of the fungus extending off them like veins. As I approached another turn, I noticed the small, pulsating black mass on the corner of the wall and ceiling. I touched it gingerly, and it erupted into a swarm of eight-legged bodies, scattering as the arachnids skittered away from the offending digit. Startled, I pulled away my hand and backed away with a gasp. Just daddy long legs, I thought to myself, gingerly avoiding stepping on the dozens of harvestmen which were scampering across the floor. I continued onward. It felt like I had been walking forever, and I had no idea how long I had been there. I remembered stories of people who had dreams from which they felt like lasted years, how they awoke missing spouses they never married, children who were never born, and I started to become afraid that I would never leave. As I started to panic, I started to hear something which pierced the unending silence of the dead city, a faint hum of static. like a whole white noise machine set to low volume. It reminded me of the gentle roar of ocean waves upon a distant shore. I began to move towards the noise, wanting to be free of the monotony of pointless exploration. I quickened my pace, jogging down the black corridor towards the static. As I rounded the corner at the end of the hallway, I caught a glimpse of something else, something pale, moving around the corner. As it moved away from me, the static grew quieter. I started to take a step towards where the thing had left when I woke up. Once again, I felt rested and energized, but the dream lingered in my mind. It was much longer this time, and felt more vivid. Explaining away the dream lasted longer simply because I slept more than the night before. It was the weekend, so I decided to spend the day cleaning up my apartment and doing some long overdue chores. The energy I got from the sleep was stronger, more pure than anything caffeine could produce. I didn't need to touch an energy drink or a cup of coffee for the whole day. By the time I was done, the apartment looked cleaner than it had in years. I ordered something for takeout for the night, a reward for a good day's work, before spending some time reading, something I usually didn't have the mental clarity to do. By the time I felt tired enough to head off to bed, it was nearly 12 a.m. I went into the bedroom and changed into my pajamas for bed. I looked over at the Somnidril on my nightstand. I knew I wouldn't be able to get to sleep without it, but I still felt trepidation. I remembered the previous dream quite strongly, more than I had any dream before. It felt so real, all 5 senses engaged. It had frightened me, but at the same time, it felt better than I ever had. I felt like the constant drowsiness which hung over my life like a fog was finally lifted, that I was free. Before I could change my mind, I popped one of the gel capsules in my mouth and swallowed, laying in bed and counting the seconds as I waited for sleep. Once again, exactly 23 seconds passed before I fell asleep. I was in a long, bare hallway, dimly illuminated despite there being no source of light. It seemed to continue onward in front of me into infinity. The same black mold grew in odd clumps on the walls, and I could see a twitching mass of Daddy Longlegs near the ceiling. I turned around and saw the hallway continue on and on and on ad infinitum behind me as well. It seemed like the whole world had been replaced with these miles of concrete. In no particular hurry, I turned back around and started walking. I reflected on how quickly the transition from the waking world to the dream had been. It felt less as if I drifted off to sleep, and more as if I'd suddenly been instantaneously transported into another place. It didn't feel like I was asleep. That sense of being guided along by the whims of my unconscious mind wasn't there. I was wholly lucid and entirely aware of my surroundings. I could feel the cold, slightly damp concrete beneath my bare feet. I could smell the scent of rot and stale air. I could hear the tinnitus ringing in my ears due to the utter and complete silence, broken only by the stepping of feet as I marched endlessly onward. I tried to keep track of how long I had been there, but it is hard to tell time without a watch nor visible sky. It could have been hours, or merely 20 minutes. There was no way for me to tell. I didn't feel any hunger or thirst, so it could not have been too long. I started to hear the faintest hum of static coming from behind me. I turned around and squinted. peering into the distance, straining my eyes to catch even a glimpse of the source of the noise. At first I didn't see anything at all, just an expansive hallway, stretching on forever. But then I noticed a very slight hint of movement in the distance, something large and indistinct, so far away it was barely visible, but rapidly getting closer. I turned around and started running at full speed. I was glad I had saved my energy before, because now I needed to move as quickly as possible. I pushed myself as hard as I could, lungs burning from the effort, as I filled them with musty, stale air. I could hear the roaring static increase in volume behind me, but there seemed to be no end to this blank, featureless corridor. My muscles began to ache with the strain, my body begging me to just stop, lie down, and accept my fate. I was running on pure adrenaline, pushed on by the primal need to live, to survive. The once faint static was now almost unbearable in the intensity. It sounded like I was being pursued by a boombox, blasting the sound of TV static at full volume. My ears felt as though they were going to burst from the intense noise. I shook my head and closed my eyes, trying to block out the dreadful cacophony. I then tripped. I sprawled out across the hard concrete, getting the briefest glimpse of my pursuer. An amorphous mass of gray cloth and outstretched, pale arms, covered with black veins of mold. Hundreds of harvestmen skittered on spindly legs through the holes of its voluminous robes, and it glided towards me at a speed like a freight train. The unbearable roar of static ceased as I felt warm liquid dribble out my ears. A pale, long-nailed hand grasped my leg, and I screamed as I felt its touch burn my flesh. And then I was awake. Blood stained my pillow, dripping from my deafened ears. I fell out of bed screaming, but I couldn't hear my own cries. I attempted to stand up, but stumbled, my leg burning with intense pain. Gingerly, I rolled up my pant leg, revealing a white mark in the shape of a handprint. According to the doctors, both my eardrums had been severely ruptured. I should be able to recover in a few weeks if I make sure they don't get infected. They didn't even try to come up with a good explanation. According to them, I must have sleepwalked and jammed pencils in my ears. They couldn't explain the handprint either. It looked like frostbite, but there was no way I could have gotten it under the blanket of my heated room. They insisted that the handprint shape of the mark must be a simple coincidence. I managed to get a week off from work to recover, but I had to use up all of my sick days and remaining vacation hours to do it. It's been 5 days since the incident, and I haven't been able to sleep. I've tried everything, but no matter what, I just can't make myself lose consciousness. Without sleep, the brain starts to fail. Nobody knows exactly what will happen when it will outright kill you, but I must be getting close. I've begun hallucinating now, seeing little veins of black mold on my walls, daddy longlegs climbing on the ceiling, and every so often I hear the faintest hint of static. I need to sleep, but I know now that the only way I'm going to get any rest is to go back to that horrible place. I have a glass of water and a pill of Somnidril on my nightstand. Pray for me.
I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, it helps the channel a lot. See you next time. Hello there everyone, welcome to my humble abode. I hope you're all doing well. and staying hydrated. Today we will be reading An Open Letter to Those Who Can't Sleep. Written by Edwin H. Setan. I hope you enjoy, and without further ado, let's get started. I can't fall asleep. Not for the reason you may think. This isn't I ate too much before bed and now I can't stop trying to fall asleep. No. I am incapable of sleep. I have chosen to reject sleep. This is not my life spiraling into chaos. I know what you're thinking, because I've thought it before. Grease seeps down my skin, and as I write this, my broken eyes scream for relief. But I know I can't. I've elected to sleep in shifts, scheduled intervals of timed sleep. The psychological study showed that the average human can last up to 14 days before they drop dead. It takes the average human 15 minutes to fall asleep and roughly 1.5 hours to slip into REM sleep. So every 13 days, just to be safe, you must schedule a 3-hour long sleep. Just enough to survive. As little to dream as possible. I can't fall asleep, and now presumably neither can you. To whoever reads this, you are the reason I have elected not to commit not alive. Letter has given my torment purpose. Knowing that somewhere, sometime, someone will suffer as I have suffered, and search high and low for answers, and come up with nothing but patronizing diagnoses and babbling madmen. Someone will think, as I have, that they are alone in their suffering. But you, dear reader, please take solace in knowing that I have felt your disillusionment and I share your fear. I am no longer able to enjoy my life for myself. Activities alone feel like feverish bouts of amnesia. Activities with loved ones feel like exercise in schizophrenia. I know what they're thinking. I feel what they're thinking, but unlike the bums, downers, and mad, I cannot allow myself to sleep for fear of what lies beyond the empty veil of dreams. I sleep, and then I awake to the same beginning, an empty hotel of some sort. Its design is as vibrant and flawless as it is unsettling and oppressive. I walk towards it as I always have, because I know what lies behind. I can't recall the first time I found out, but I've always known. Do not alert it to your presence. Do not stay put. I've tried doing such and suffered the infinite consequences many, many times. Walk forward down the seemingly infinite stretch of corridors, each one bending to a different direction. Don't try to memorize the layout, as it seems to change every time. The doors are just as infinite as they are pointless. All are locked, and the ones that aren't just lead to more hallway. Now, this next step will frighten you, but I cannot stress it enough. When the chimes toll, turn around and run as fast as you can in the other direction. Don't be swayed by anything it may say. Sometimes the thoughts in your mind will betray you. Don't be fooled. Run in the other direction. It may try to sway you with voices of people you know. It may come in the form of a parent singing a childhood lullaby. It may claim to be a spouse or a loved one being violently assaulted. And sometimes it doesn't say anything at all. The silence becomes so much. You begin to hear your intestines churning as clockwork. The sound of blood being pumped through your veins becomes as loud as a sawmill. Sometimes the air you breathe sounds as a lamb that's been crushed into a meat processor. Do not turn around. Once you endure your 3 hours, you can return to waking life. I have failed these instructions too many times to count. I have turned around and seen it. I have seen its fleshy, fiery form, its coagulated muscles flexing and contorting around a blinding center. And I have seen the shapeless hell that awaits you. The closer it gets to you, tearing and erasing its way through the corridors, seemingly in the blink of an eye. Every cell populating your body becomes torn apart, separated. It begins twisting and contorting around every bone, every vein, every nerve, snapping, bending, tearing, ripping. It rearranges your shape and structure, and you feel every bit of it. Once it tires of your predictable agony, it begins drawing you into itself. It forms its tendrils to hook itself into you, your disembodied screams becoming deafening, as it weaves its way into its searing core, barbs upon prongs, upon bristles, upon membranes, puncturing you, what was once considered to be a part of you, every inch of flesh consumed but still aware, crushing you into paste only to be fully assimilated into itself as it continues to stalk other victims. It uses your mouth to form voices in tongues and words you've never thought to speak. It violates of you at once, only to use your pain as momentum to move it forwards. You've no ability to move, no ability to speak, no ability to breathe, and no capacity to comprehend. You've only the torment of knowing and feeling what is happening to you and watching it as it uses you to do the same to others. Others will think you're a depraved soul begging for attention, or a madman who's in need of a doctor, and maybe you'll start to believe them. I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking. But you are not like them. With them, they let their illness speak for themselves. It's a tumorous line of thinking hell bent on its own preservation, even at the behest of its host. But with you, oh you, my poor suffering cohort, hopefully I can help you. Perhaps this letter will arrive before the hellscape has come to you. But it will. And you must spend every waking moment preparing for it. We are different from the rest, my friend. Our nightly chases have set us apart from the rest. We are pioneers. We may be the first who peeked beyond the curtain of the great beyond and seen the indescribable visions waiting before us. But rest assured, we will not be the last.